They said the camera never lies. But in the winter of 1870, in a quiet New England town blanketed by snow and superstition, the lens of one photographer captured something that shouldn't have been possible. Two little girls, their skin pale as porcelain, their lips still tinted with life, sitting perfectly still beside an open coffin. The photograph would be known as the Prescott Sisters' post-mortem portrait. But when the negatives were developed, the eyes of the younger sister appeared to be open, not lifeless, watching. No one knew then that this photograph would spark the most unsettling rumor of the century, that one of the sisters in that frame had been buried alive. But before we continue with this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. The story begins in the small mill town of Prescott Hollow, Massachusetts, tucked between the bare forests and frost-bitten fields of the post-Civil War years. Life there was still marked by grief, sons lost in battle, mothers taken by fever, and children claimed by the silent hands of pneumonia and cholera. But what haunted Prescott Hollow most wasn't war or disease, it was what followed after death, the fear of being buried alive. In those days, medical science was crude. The line between life and death wasn't a clean break. It was a guess. A doctor would place a mirror before the lips, and if no mist appeared, he would sign the certificate. But what if the breath was faint? What if the heart, slowed by illness or shock, hid its rhythm beneath still ribs? Dozens of cases in 19th century America hinted that the dead sometimes awoke beneath 6 feet of soil, claw marks on the underside of coffin lids, splintered wood, and the desperate remains of those who had suffocated in darkness. The Prescott family had heard such tales, of course. Everyone had, but they never imagined one would touch their own blood. Margaret and Eliza Prescott, two sisters born only 18 months apart, were the pride of their mother Eleanor, a quiet seamstress who'd lost her husband to a mill accident years earlier. They lived in a weathered clapboard house on the outskirts of town, near the riverbank where the fog gathered thickest each morning. Margaret, the elder at 11, had the calm, careful nature of someone twice her age. Eliza, only 9, was wild, curious, and endlessly talkative. She'd climb the apple tree behind their home just to watch the trains pass in the distance. That winter, however, the air turned cruel. A sickness spread through town, a coughing fever that took children first. One by one, homes closed their shutters. The church bells tolled daily. And then, in January of 1870, the sickness reached the Prescott house. It began with Eliza. Her laughter vanished, replaced by a dry cough that rattled her chest through the night. Eleanor did everything she could. Poultices, herbal steams, even prayers whispered through trembling hands. But medicine in Prescott Hollow was as thin as its hope. Within a week, Eliza's small body went still. Her skin cooled, her pulse fainted away. The doctor arrived at dawn, his breath visible in the cold room. He pressed his fingers to her wrist, listened at her chest, and after a minute that felt like eternity, he gave a single, slow nod. "I'm sorry. Mrs. Prescott, she's gone." Eleanor fell to her knees beside the bed, clutching the still hand of her daughter, whispering her name as if it might bring her back. Back then, it was common for families to take one last photograph with their departed. Post-mortem photography, they called it, a way to hold on to what time had stolen. Death was not hidden away. It was dressed, posed, and remembered. So 2 days after Eliza's passing, the local photographer, Mr. Tobias Gray, arrived with his heavy wooden camera and iron tripod. He was a quiet man, one of those strange artists fascinated by death's stillness. His studio smelled of chemicals and varnish. But this time, he came to the Prescott home as the snow fell outside and candles burned low inside. The parlor had been prepared, the curtains drawn, the coffin placed near the window where the pale light touched gently across Eliza's face. Eleanor had dressed both girls in white lace. She wanted one last portrait, the sisters together, just as they always had been. When the photograph was taken, Margaret was told to sit very still beside her sister's coffin, holding Eliza's hand. The exposure time was long, nearly 15 seconds. Long enough for small movements to blur. "Just keep your gaze downward," Mr. Gray instructed softly, adjusting the focus. Think of your sister as sleeping. The shutter clicked. A silence followed, heavier than the air itself. But when the plate was developed later that evening in Tobias Gray's studio, something went terribly wrong. Or terribly right, depending on who told the story. In the chemical light, the ghostly image began to form. The faint silhouettes of the two sisters emerging from the shadows of the silver plate. And then Tobias froze. Eliza's eyes, which had been closed in the coffin, were open in the photograph. Wide, glinting with the faintest reflection of light. At first he thought it a trick of exposure. Maybe movement, maybe a reflection. But the more he stared, the more alive she appeared. Her hand, the one Margaret had been holding, seemed to clutch back. Tobias tried to shake the unease, blaming it on fatigue. Yet when Eleanor came the next morning to collect the photograph, she gasped. "She's looking at me," she whispered. "Eliza's looking right at me." Rumors began to spread that week. The townsfolk of Prescott Hollow were deeply superstitious. Whispers of the girl who woke for the photograph drifted through church pews and tavern corners. Some said Mr. Gray had caught her soul between worlds. Others claimed the doctor had made a mistake, that Eliza Prescott had never truly died. By the second week of February, the ground thawed just enough for the cemetery to take the new burials. The Prescott family held a small funeral beneath gray skies. Margaret stood beside her mother, her tiny hand clutching the photograph in secret. That night, she could not sleep. The wind howled through the thin walls, and she swore she heard her sister's voice whispering through the cracks of the floorboards. "Maggie." She pressed the pillow to her ears, and yet the whisper came again. "Maggie, I'm cold." In the morning, Eleanor found her daughter pale and trembling, refusing to eat. "It was just a dream," she said softly. But the next night the whisper returned, faint, distant, but real. "Maggie, it's dark." Margaret began to change. She refused to go near the window. She jumped at every creak of the floor. She claimed that Eliza's reflection appeared in the mirror behind her, her lips moving silently. Mr. Gray, meanwhile, became obsessed with his photograph. He printed it again and again, trying to understand what he had captured. Each print came out the same, Eliza's eyes open. By spring, whispers had turned to accusation. The townspeople began saying that Eleanor Prescott's grief had turned into madness, that she had begged the gravedigger to check the coffin. Some even said she'd tried to have the grave reopened in the middle of the night, and then, one morning in March, she was gone. No one saw Eleanor Prescott again. Weeks passed. The house fell silent. Margaret was taken in by the local pastor and his wife, but she rarely spoke. All she ever carried was that same small photograph. It wasn't until the summer of 1871 that the truth began to surface, or something like it. A storm hit Prescott Hollow, and flooding washed away part of the old cemetery hill. One of the coffins, light, small, and waterlogged, broke free from the earth. When the townsfolk came to retrieve it, they noticed deep scratches on the inside of the lid. The wood was splintered where the fingers had torn against it. The nameplate read, "Eliza Prescott." The townspeople never spoke openly of what they saw when they opened that coffin, but those who were there never slept soundly again. One witness, the gravedigger himself, left town the next day. The pastor refused to preach the following Sunday. And as for Tobias Gray, the photographer, he was found weeks later in his studio, the negatives burned, his mind gone. On his wall, carved into the plaster, were two words. She blinked. The photograph, the original, unburned one, would reappear decades later in a private collection, its authenticity debated by historians. Some say it was a clever manipulation, an early double exposure. Others say it was proof of something far darker, a mother's denial made real by the cruel timing of medicine's ignorance. But those who have seen the image up close describe the same detail every time. In the lower right corner, just beneath the hem of Eliza's white dress, are 4 faint lines, like the marks of small fingers pressed against glass. Some believe they were scratches on the lens. Others say they were her last message, captured forever between life and death. Even now, more than a century and a half later, the legend of the Prescott Sisters haunts the archives of early American photography. Historians and skeptics continue to debate the story. Was it a tragic accident? A photographer's error? Or the moment a dying girl awoke beneath the weight of mourning hands, calling out too faintly for anyone to hear? All that remains is the photograph, a portrait of two sisters, one alive, one, perhaps not entirely. And somewhere, in that grainy sepia blur of 1870, the line between the living and the dead fades into a single silent stare. The summer of 1871 burned hotter than any the town of Prescott Hollow could remember. The rains that had unearthed the coffin had passed, but the air still carried that strange smell, wet soil mixed with something older, sour and faintly sweet. The people said it was just rot from the flooded graves, but those who had seen the coffin of Eliza Prescott knew better. They'd looked into her sunken face and seen the horror carved into the inside of that lid. They'd seen the desperate marks her small hands had left, and none of them, not one, ever forgot. The town itself changed after that. Shops closed earlier. Curtains stayed drawn. Parents kept their children close after sundown. The graveyard on Miller's Hill, once a quiet slope where sparrows perched, became a place no one dared pass after dusk. Even the pastor refused to hold services near it, saying softly, "Some souls don't rest easy." But the one most affected was Tobias Gray, the photographer whose camera had captured that cursed image. When the flooding happened and the coffin broke open, Tobias had gone to the scene out of morbid curiosity. He shouldn't have. From that day forward, something inside him began to unravel. He stopped accepting commissions. The curtains of his studio stayed closed, and the smell of chemicals and burnt paper began seeping into the street outside. Those who did catch a glimpse of him described a man who hadn't slept in weeks, eyes hollow, fingers stained black from developer fluid, muttering to himself about the blink. It was late July when the pastor's wife, Mrs. Holloway, decided to visit him. The church had been worried. Tobias had missed rent, and no one had seen him in a fortnight. She knocked softly on the studio door. No answer. She pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was suffocatingly hot, the air heavy with chemicals. Photographic plates littered the floor, most of them shattered. On the work table lay dozens of copies of that same photograph, the Prescott Sisters, but each print was slightly different. In some, Eliza's eyes seemed wider. In others, her lips twitched upward like the trace of a smile. One even showed a faint blur near her face, as if something had moved at the last moment of exposure. And on the far wall, etched with a knife into the plaster, were words scrawled over and over. She was never dead. Tobias was found in the basement, sitting in front of his dark room tray, staring into the reflection of the photograph floating on the surface of the chemical bath. When he finally looked up, his pupils were pinpricks, his voice a rasp. "She moved, Mrs. Holloway," he said, when the shutter opened. I saw her hand twitch. Mrs. Holloway backed away, clutching her shawl. "Mr. Gray, you need rest. It's grief or guilt." He slammed his hand down on the table, startling her. "You don't understand." She looked through the glass. 2 days later, Tobias disappeared. His studio was found empty, save for one plate drying on the rack, the last photograph he ever developed. It showed his reflection in the mirror of his dark room, and behind him, the faint outline of a small girl standing in the corner. Meanwhile, Margaret Prescott had been taken to live with a distant aunt in the next town, in a quiet farmhouse surrounded by cornfields. But peace did not follow her. The nightmares did. Each night she dreamt of dirt pressing down on her chest, of clawing at wood until her fingers bled, of screaming without sound. And every morning she woke with soil beneath her nails. Her aunt tried to dismiss it. "It's your imagination, child." But Margaret knew what she felt. She could still hear Eliza's voice sometimes, whispering her name in that same small tone as before. "Maggie, it's dark again." At first she thought it was just grief. But then, objects began to move. A doll, Eliza's old favorite, one Margaret had refused to bring from the old house, appeared on her pillow one morning. Its glass eyes cracked. The parlor clock, which had stopped the night Eliza died, began ticking again at midnight. And once, as Margaret brushed her hair before the mirror, she saw her sister's reflection standing behind her, pale, smiling faintly, lips moving though no sound came. She dropped the brush and screamed. When her aunt rushed in, there was nothing there, only the mirror, fogged, as though someone had breathed against the glass. Word reached Prescott Hollow that the Prescott girl was not right in the head. The pastor visited, trying to pray with her. But every time he spoke of peace, Margaret's voice would rise, trembling with fury. She wasn't dead. "You put her there!"
"You all did!"
The pastor left pale-faced, muttering prayers under his breath. A few weeks later, the aunt wrote to the local asylum, the Lowell Institute for the Feeble and Disturbed, asking for help. "The child has visions," she wrote. "She speaks to her sister in the night. Sometimes I think she's listening to something I cannot hear." But before the asylum carriage could arrive, Margaret vanished. It was early September, a foggy morning. The aunt had gone to fetch water from the well, and when she returned, Margaret's bed was empty. The window stood open, the curtains swaying gently. On the nightstand lay the same photograph, the Prescott Sisters, now warped from age and damp, and on the back, written in a trembling hand, were 3 words, "She's waiting below." They searched the fields for days, the marsh, the riverbank, but no sign of her was ever found. For a time, Prescott Hollow tried to forget. The story became a whisper, then a ghost story told by children who dared each other to walk past the old Prescott house at night. But there were still those who remembered, those who'd seen the photograph, those who'd helped bury the girl who might not have been dead. In 1873, when the town's records were finally recompiled after the flood, the Prescott name appeared only once, a note in faded ink beside the family plot number. It read, "Reinterred, per request of surviving kin." No one ever said who made the request. Decades passed. The town changed names, the graveyard moved. The Prescott house rotted into the earth, its timbers collapsing under ivy and silence. But the photograph survived. It resurfaced in 1901, in the possession of a Boston collector named Arthur Wexley, who specialized in death portraits. He displayed it briefly at a private gallery exhibition, alongside other post-mortem photographs. Most viewers passed it without much notice, until one man, an amateur photographer, claimed that when he viewed it through a magnifying glass, he saw something impossible. In the background of the image, reflected faintly in the parlor mirror, was a third figure, a girl, standing, watching. When Wexley checked the original plate under lamplight, the figure was still there, faint but undeniable. That night he locked the photograph in his study. The next morning, he was found dead, seated in his chair, eyes wide open, a look of sheer terror frozen on his face. The photograph was gone, and then silence again, until 1937, when a reporter for the Boston Herald named Clara Niles began researching forgotten American folklore. She came across a passing mention of the Prescott photograph in a journal kept by a museum curator. Intrigued, she began to dig. Through archives, church records, and old death registries, most of the names were smudged by time. But she found enough to trace the family's lineage, the address of the old house, and, miraculously, a surviving relative in her late 80s living in a care home outside of Worcester. When Clara visited, she was met by a frail woman with trembling hands and cloudy eyes. "I'm Margaret," the woman whispered. Clara froze. "Margaret Prescott." The old woman nodded weakly. "Yes, but I wasn't the one buried." The reporter leaned closer, her pen trembling. "What do you mean?" Margaret's eyes, faded and unfocused, seemed to stare past the ceiling. "They got the names wrong," she murmured. "It was me who died first, and she who came back." Clara's notes from that interview end there. The next page is smeared, the ink washed as if by water, or tears. But in her final entry, written weeks later, she records one last detail. "Visited the old Prescott burial ground today. Found one remaining headstone, half buried. Could make out only a few letters. The rest eroded. Beside it, a child's toy doll, half turned to dust. I felt, watched." That same week, neighbors reported seeing lights flicker in Clara's apartment at odd hours, as though flash powder were going off behind closed curtains. When police entered, they found her camera smashed, her negatives burned. Only one photograph remained intact. It was a mirror selfie, common for journalists of the time. But behind her reflection, faint in the darkness, was the figure of a small girl with pale eyes, and a smile too wide for her face. The Prescott legend has since become one of the most whispered stories among historians of early photography, a case study in grief, superstition, and the fragile line between scientific certainty and human fear. But some insist there's more to it. The few remaining copies of the original Prescott Sisters photograph are said to behave strangely under light. Some viewers claim the image changes, that Eliza's eyes seem to follow them across the room, or that her mouth shifts ever so slightly, forming shapes that look like words. Others say if you stare long enough into the background mirror, you can see movement, the faint suggestion of a hand reaching from behind the glass. Those who've studied it closely never keep it long. Most either destroy it or pass it on quickly, unwilling to keep the thing in their homes, because in every version of the photograph, even those copied, scanned, or digitally restored, one detail never disappears. 4 faint lines, like scratches. Right where the glass meets the frame. They say history forgets the dead, but sometimes the dead refuse to be forgotten. And for those who still search the archives of Prescott Hollow, hoping to uncover the truth behind the photograph, one warning remains scrawled in fading ink across the back of an old case file, the handwriting believed to be Tobias Gray's. Do not stare at her eyes under the red light. She blinks. When the Boston Herald announced the death of journalist Clara Niles in October 1937, the obituary was short and strangely formal. It said only that she passed away suddenly at her home, age 34, due to exhaustion and nervous collapse. There was no mention of the photograph, no mention of the Prescott case, and certainly no mention of what police found that night on her apartment walls. They said every inch of wallpaper was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same image over and over again. 2 girls in white, one with her eyes open. Some prints were upside down. Some had been torn, stitched back together with black thread. In the center of the room, where the light bulb hung low, the last photograph was pinned to the ceiling, positioned directly above Clara's bed. Her eyes, when they found her, were open, fixed upward. For decades after her death, the story went silent again, until 1952, when an archivist named Dr. Harold Wren, a professor of photographic history at Harvard, stumbled across Clara's old research trunk. It had been donated to the university by her surviving relatives, along with her typewriter, field notes, and a box of undeveloped negatives. Dr. Wren was a rational man. He'd spent his life studying the psychology of visual media, why the human brain saw patterns where none existed. He dismissed the legend as nonsense, a relic of superstition clinging to the 19th century. But when he began to catalog the trunk, he noticed one envelope, heavier than the rest, labeled only with 3 words in Clara's handwriting: "Do not develop." Inside were 7 glass negatives, each wrapped carefully in thin black paper. He hesitated only a moment before setting one into the enlarger. The red bulb glowed above his workbench. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, as the image emerged from the chemical bath, his hand began to shake. It was the Prescott Sisters photograph. But this time the frame was wider. The parlor stretched farther back, and in the farthest corner, half hidden by shadow, a small figure stood facing the wall. He looked closer. The figure's hands were pressed flat against the wallpaper, as though feeling for a way out. For weeks afterward, Dr. Wren became obsessed. He developed the remaining negatives one by one, documenting each difference, each impossible variation. In one, Eliza's head was turned slightly toward the camera. In another, Margaret's expression had changed, her eyes hollow, her lips drawn tight as if holding back a scream. But the 7th plate was different. When it was first immersed in the developer, the image that began to appear wasn't of the sisters at all. It was of Clara Niles herself, seated at her desk, a photograph held in her lap, staring at something beyond the camera. And behind her, in the mirror of her apartment wall, stood the same 2 girls, faint, transparent, watching her. Dr. Wren staggered back, spilling the tray. The image began to fade before his eyes, the chemicals hissing as if reacting to heat that wasn't there. He locked the plates away that night, but when he returned the next morning, they were gone. The janitor later told police that he'd seen the professor leave the building at dawn, clutching a box and muttering under his breath. "She blinked," he kept saying. "She blinked." 3 days later, his car was found abandoned on the outskirts of Prescott Hollow, Massachusetts, the same town where it had all begun 80 years earlier. What happened next became one of the strangest unsolved events in the state's history. A local farmer, Samuel Bird, reported seeing light flickering from the ruins of the old Prescott house. At first he thought it was lightning, but the sky was clear. He approached, calling out. No answer. Inside, he found Dr. Wren's camera tripod set up before a cracked mirror. The old walls were covered in photographs, some pinned, others nailed directly into the wood. But what made him drop his lantern and run screaming into the night wasn't the photographs. It was the reflection. In the mirror, the light of the fallen lantern still burned, yet there was no fire in the room. Only the faint glow outlining two figures standing side by side. When police arrived the next morning, the house was empty. Wren's box of negatives was gone, but one photograph was left behind, wedged into the mirror's broken frame. It showed a man's reflection, Wren's, his face pale, eyes wide, mouth frozen in a silent cry, and beside him, the faint outline of a child's hand pressed against the glass. The file on his disappearance remains open to this day. By the late 1960s, the Prescott legend had grown into a full-blown folklore phenomenon. Paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and amateur historians all descended on the remains of Prescott Hollow, now little more than a cluster of decaying foundations swallowed by the forest. They brought tape recorders, infrared cameras, and daring smiles. Most found nothing but dust and broken stones. But every so often, one group would return with stories of whispers caught on tape, faint children's voices saying names that weren't theirs. One recording, archived by a local college radio host, captured this chilling exchange. Investigator 1. It's freezing in here, can you feel that? Investigator 2. Wait, look. The lens fogged up. Investigator 1. Say your name. Pause. Unknown voice, childlike. Eliza. The tape ended with a scream and the sound of shattering glass. Meanwhile, in Boston, a small museum exhibit titled Mourning in Memory Victorian Death Culture quietly displayed what it claimed to be the restored Prescott photograph. The curator, Dr. Lenora May, said she'd acquired it from a private collection. It was sealed behind UV glass, under dim lighting. Visitors were warned not to use flash photography, officially to prevent damage, unofficially because, as the curator whispered to journalists, it tends to reflect things that aren't there. A few curious souls ignored the warning. One photograph taken by a visitor's camera showed something unexpected. In the display glass, right where the two sisters' faces reflected, a third figure appeared, smaller, darker, smiling faintly. The museum denied it was real, calling it a trick of light. But the photo went missing from their archives weeks later. Dr. May resigned soon after, citing personal health concerns. Those who knew her said she hadn't slept for days, claiming she heard scratching behind her walls at night. What few realize is that, throughout all this, a single thread connects each tragedy, the negative itself. The original wet plate glass used by Tobias Gray in 1870. Experts who studied early photography claim such plates were fragile, yet somehow this one endured, passing from hand to hand across generations. Each person who tried to destroy it failed. Burn it, the flame would sputter out. Smash it, the shards would reform, edges melting back together like wax. In 1971, a private letter surfaced from a retired investigator who claimed to have seen it. His account, kept secret until his death, reads, "The negative feels warm to the touch, as if alive. When held to the light, the figures on the glass move, slowly, like they're waiting." By the turn of the 21st century, the legend of the Prescott Sisters became more than folklore. It became a fascination of modern internet forums, threads dedicated to cursed images, lost photographs, and the idea of liminal moments caught on film. Digital archivists debated whether the photo ever truly existed. Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax from a time when long exposures made illusions easy. But every so often, a new scan would appear online, grainy, yellowed, eerily consistent with 19th century photochemistry, and with it, the same reaction: People claimed the image changed when viewed alone at night, that it pulsed faintly, that the reflection of the viewer appeared inside the photograph, between the two girls. Those who traced the photograph's digital history noticed something stranger still. The file name always contained a date, and that date was always 1 week ahead of the viewer's present day, like a countdown. Historians argue endlessly over what the Prescott story truly means: an allegory of grief, a warning about the limits of science, or proof that photographs can capture what the eye cannot bear to see. But in 2008, an old wooden box appeared at an estate auction in Boston, labeled simply "Property of Tobias Gray." Inside were a few decayed tools, a cracked lens, and one small glass plate, wrapped in paper that read, "Last Exposure." The winning bidder was an anonymous collector, who reportedly paid $42,000. When asked later what he'd found on the plate, he refused to comment. But his assistant quit the next morning, telling reporters, "It blinked. God help me, it blinked." Today, the location of the original Prescott Sisters photograph remains unknown. Some say it was finally destroyed, melted down, erased from existence. Others believe it still exists somewhere, sealed in an archive box that hums faintly when the lights go out. But for those who've studied it, there's one final curiosity that no skeptic can explain. In every documented copy, every reproduction and reprint across 150 years, one detail remains unchanged. The faint shadow of a third child reflected in the background mirror, and beside her, etched into the wooden frame in Tobias Gray's own trembling hand, two words almost invisible to the naked eye: "Still here." The rain had not stopped for 3 days. The skies above the Prescott estate hung like a shroud, gray, swollen and heavy with secrets that refused to wash away. Inside the decaying house, the smell of damp wood and candle wax mixed with something else, something faintly metallic, almost like blood. Margaret Prescott sat by the cold hearth, her dress wrinkled and torn, eyes hollow as if they had forgotten how to dream. The once bright child now spoke little, and when she did, it was in whispers, half to herself, half to someone only she could see. The townsfolk avoided her now. Some said she was cursed. Others swore they had seen her walking near her sister's grave in the middle of the night, barefoot and pale, as though following the sound of someone calling her name. But no one dared to approach her. No one except Tobias Gray. The photographer had changed beyond recognition. His once confident hands now trembled. His studio, once filled with portraits of smiling families, had been boarded up. He avoided mirrors, avoided light, and every night he dreamt of the same thing: 2 small girls standing in the fog, staring back at him through the lens of a camera that no longer existed. Tobias carried with him a guilt that gnawed like a living thing. He had taken that post-mortem photograph of little Eliza Prescott, or at least, that's what he thought he had done. But the girl had blinked. He had seen it. For a fraction of a second, through the glass plate, her eyelids fluttered, not in death's stillness, but in something that could only have been life. And he had done nothing. He had pressed the shutter. And with that single act, he might have captured a soul still fighting to breathe. Now, 3 weeks later, word had spread through the town, quiet but insistent, that the Prescott grave had been disturbed. Eleanor Prescott, the girl's mother, had been found collapsed near the cemetery gate, murmuring something over and over: "She's cold, but not gone. She's cold, but not gone." The vicar, alarmed, sent for Tobias. And against his own terror, he went. That evening, with the rain turning the soil into dark mud, a small group gathered by the Prescott plot: 2 men with shovels, the vicar with his lantern, and Tobias Gray, his boots sinking into the earth as if it wanted to swallow him whole. The vicar hesitated before giving the nod when the shovel struck. The wet earth, each sound echoed through. The mist like a heartbeat. It took almost an hour. When the wooden lid was finally revealed, Tobias fell to his knees. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't turn away. The vicar lifted the lantern. The coffin lid creaked open. Inside lay the small body of Eliza Prescott. Her hands raised slightly, her fingernails bloodied and broken, scratching desperately against the lid from the inside. Her eyes were wide open. The vicar dropped the lantern, and the flame went out. Someone screamed, but Tobias, he couldn't move. He just stared. He had photographed her, cold, still and at peace. But this body was not at peace. This body had fought. And suddenly, the whispering began. It was faint, carried by the rain, like the sound of wind through reeds. But Tobias heard it clearly. A voice. A child's voice. "You took my breath." He stumbled back, shaking his head, mud clinging to his coat. No, it wasn't me. It wasn't. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You took my breath and gave me light." The others couldn't hear it. Only Tobias could. That night, he returned to his studio, broken, drenched, delirious. He tore the curtains down and smashed the remaining glass plates. But one remained, the one he had hidden, the original negative of Eliza's photograph. He held it against the lantern light, trembling. The image flickered, two small figures just as he remembered. But now, Eliza's eyes were open, her lips were parted, and behind her, faintly visible, was something new. A third figure. Margaret. But she hadn't been there the day he took the photo. He was certain. Morning came with thunder. Neighbors found Tobias Gray's door wide open, the air inside heavy with the smell of burnt chemicals. The man himself was found slumped in his chair, eyes wide, fingers stiffly gripping the camera that had melted under its own flash powder. On the wall above his desk, a single photograph had been pinned. It was unlike the others. The exposure was wrong, the faces blurred. Two girls stood in the frame, one with her head tilted slightly, the other looking directly into the lens. But in the corner, the faint outline of a man could be seen kneeling, his hands raised as though begging for forgiveness. Tobias Gray's eyes, even in death, were fixed upon that image. When news of his death reached the Prescott home, Eleanor collapsed once more. Margaret, however, said nothing. She simply stood at the window, watching the rain fall, and whispered to no one. He heard her. Now he knows. That night, she disappeared. The servants searched every room, every path, every corner of the graveyard. All they found were footprints, small, bare feet leading from the house to the edge of Eliza's grave, and then stopping. No one ever saw Margaret Prescott again. Weeks later, a young boy from the town claimed he'd found something while fishing by the riverbank. A photograph, damp, torn but still visible. Two sisters, holding hands, their faces pale, their eyes blackened by decay of the print. But one detail remained clear. They were smiling, and behind them stood Tobias Gray's camera, pointed not at them, but directly at the viewer. From that day, no one entered the Prescott estate again. The house rotted into the earth, the trees swallowed the gate, and the graveyard became just another patch of forgotten ground. But locals still say that on quiet nights, when the fog rolls thick over the valley, you can hear the faint click of a camera shutter, and two children laughing in the rain. The wind had grown colder that night, slicing through the empty halls of the Prescott house. Shadows moved unnaturally, stretching long over the cracked floorboards. Margaret Prescott had been missing for days, and Tobias Gray, consumed by guilt and obsession, wandered through the house as though it were a labyrinth constructed of his own sins. The lantern flickered in his hand, casting trembling light across the photographs pinned to the walls. Each one was a frozen memory of what he had done, yet somehow they were alive. The faces of the sisters seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly. Their eyes followed him. Their lips, they whispered. "You left her in the dark." Tobias froze. The words came not from the air, but from somewhere deeper, inside his own chest. He dropped to his knees, hands trembling over the wet plate negatives he had hidden from the world. Every photograph he had taken, every exposure, every print, had become a trap. He realized with a sickening clarity that he had not captured death, he had captured life, and in doing so, he had imprisoned it. Suddenly, a sound came from the attic, faint, dragging, deliberate. Margaret's voice, though barely a whisper, called his name. Tobias, you must see, you must see. Against every instinct, he climbed the narrow stairs. Each step groaned under his weight. The attic door was closed. Dust hung thick in the air, clinging to his lungs. He pushed it open. There, in the center of the room, was the coffin. Its wood warped, soaked with rain, yet somehow intact. And inside, Eliza, or what remained of her, lay, small hands reaching upward, dirt still clinging to her fingernails. Margaret stood beside the coffin, pale and translucent, her eyes fixed on Tobias. "We are not gone," she said, "and we are not dead." The air shifted. The candlelight seemed to bend, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. Tobias felt the ground tremble beneath him. And then he saw them. In every mirror, in every reflective surface, the sisters' faces multiplied, surrounding him, their tiny hands pressed against the invisible walls between life and death. Eliza's lips moved in silent accusation. "You left me there." Margaret's voice joined. "And you watched." Tobias screamed. The sound swallowed by the walls. The photographs on the walls rippled, bending like water. And then, the negative in his hands burned. The image of the sisters, frozen in life and death, imprinted itself upon his mind. He could not escape it. When the townsfolk came the next morning, drawn by screams that shattered the storm, the house was silent. The front door swung on its hinges. Inside, the room was empty. No Tobias Gray, no Margaret, no Eliza. Only the photographs remained, scattered on the floor, faces blurred, eyes impossibly open. And in the center of the room lay one photograph intact. Two small girls, smiling faintly, standing hand in hand. Behind them, almost invisible, a man knelt in the mud, Tobias, and in his hands, a camera that no longer existed. A whisper echoed through the hall, though no one was there to hear. "Still here." From that day, the Prescott house was abandoned, the graveyard reclaimed by ivy, the estate swallowed by time. But travelers who passed on foggy nights swear they hear the click of a camera shutter, soft and deliberate, followed by a child's laughter. And sometimes, just sometimes, the faintest outline of two girls standing hand in hand, watching from the shadows. The town learned a hard truth. Some souls cannot rest. Some photographs do not capture death. They preserve life. And a life interrupted can haunt for generations. The curse of the Prescott Sisters was never broken. It was only waiting. A story of grief, guilt, and the fragile line between life and death. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.